There's a peculiar chill that settles in your bones the moment someone decides your worth for you. It doesn't scream. It doesn't rage. It just settles. Like frost on a window pane, subtle until it hardens into something you can't ignore. I was 29 when my boss leaned back in his leather chair, that smug smirk curling under his neatly trimmed beard, and laughed, actually laughed, when I asked for a raise. "You're already at your limit," he said, as if that verdict had been carved in stone, passed down from the heavens. As if he hadn't watched me give every ounce of myself to his firm, late nights, weekend emails, flights taken without notice, meals skipped, family missed. Limit. The word lingered in the room after I left it. I carried it like a stone in my chest, all the way down the elevator, through the marble lobby where I nodded at the security guard who never remembered my name. I remember wondering, how many times have I taken the stairs two at a time for this company, thinking urgency would earn me something more than a pat on the head? It wasn't just about the money. Not really. It was about being seen, being valued. And in that moment, I saw the truth written plainly in his face. I was a tool. Useful, perhaps even vital, but replaceable. I went home that night and opened the folder I'd kept buried in the someday drawer of my laptop. It held sketches, business plans, client lists I'd built in my spare time. It wasn't malicious. At least, not at first. It was survival, a blueprint for a future where I didn't have to beg for what I'd earned. You see, I wasn't born with a silver spoon. I came from rust. From hand-me-downs and powdered milk, from a mother who taught me how to stretch a dollar and a father who believed the best revenge was a life well lived, even if his own had been cut short before he could taste it. Every achievement I claimed came with a cost. And I'd paid it all. Quietly. Diligently. With interest. So when I opened that folder, I wasn't starting something new, I was unearthing something buried. The rival firm wasn't born out of revenge. It was born out of clarity. But revenge? That came anyway. I started in silence. That's how all my best moves begin, not with a bang, but with a breath. After that laugh, I didn't slam doors or file complaints. I simply started building. Brick by careful brick. At night, while others streamed shows or scrolled endlessly, I traced every dollar I'd earned for someone else's dream and imagined what it might feel like to own my own. My business plan became my lullaby, my morning prayer. I polished it relentlessly, streamlining the services, researching the market gaps, listing every name and face I'd ever helped that my old boss took credit for. My apartment became my war room. Whiteboards stacked against walls, late-night coffee rings on pages full of projections, and quotes from women I'd long admired scribbled onto sticky notes. I am deliberate and afraid of nothing. Audre Lorde. That one stayed above my desk. But I wasn't alone for long. Word travels in whispers, and apparently, so does potential. One by one, they found me, investors who had once raised their glasses at my boss's fancy dinners, clients I had charmed into deals he never followed through on. They remembered my voice. They remembered how I made them feel heard. And when they heard what I was building, they wanted in. "Your idea," one of them said over an espresso in a corner cafe, "feels like the future." His place? Feels like an echo. Funny, isn't it? The very people who once saw me as an assistant, a junior exec, a glorified scheduler, they now leaned in to hear my pitch, hungry for a seat at my table. By the time the ink dried on the first funding round, I'd outgrown my apartment. I rented a small, sunlit office downtown, nothing flashy, just promise in concrete form. I remember the day the sign went up on the glass door, Arden and Company. Arden. My middle name. Chosen not for vanity, but because I needed a clean name, a new legacy. My real one was still too tied to the shadows I'd walked through. And Company wasn't just a formality. It was for every woman who ever heard, "You're at your limit," and quietly decided to redefine it. I hadn't even sent out a press release when my old boss found out. One of his investors, now mine, dropped the news like an offhand comment in a strategy meeting. I wasn't there, but I imagined it, the tightening of his jaw, The way his mouth formed my name like it was a curse and a question. He underestimated me. Most do, until it's too late. But I wasn't finished yet. I hadn't even started. Power changes rooms, even when it walks in quietly. When I stepped into the first boardroom as CEO of Arden and Company, I wore the same blazer I'd worn the day I was laughed at. Not out of superstition, out of remembrance. I wanted to feel the difference in how I stood, how I spoke, how I was heard. And I was heard. Our first pitch meeting was a test. Not of our model, I knew the numbers were solid, but of me. I was the variable they were still unsure about. A woman. Young. A defector from a firm with a long, dusty legacy and a reputation built on bluster. I stood at the head of the table, outlined the strategy, then paused. One of the older men, gray at the temples and still clinging to the illusion of being the smartest in the room, leaned back, skeptical. "And what makes you think you can disrupt the market, Ms. Arden?" I didn't flinch. I smiled the way you do when you know something they don't. "Because I built it once already," I said. "I just did it under someone else's name." There was a pause, a murmur, then nods. Approval, edged with awe. After that, the doors opened. Clients followed, many of them remembering who had actually done the work back at the old firm. They remembered my name, my care, my results. And with every account we won, I watched my old boss's empire contract. Quietly, then unmistakably. One day, I received a resume in my inbox. No cover letter. No bravado. Just a name I knew well. An admin at my old firm. Smart. Capable. Overlooked. I interviewed her personally. "You sure you want to jump ship?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded. "I want to work somewhere I'm not invisible." That sealed it. By the end of the quarter, nearly a dozen of my former colleagues had followed her lead. The whispers were getting louder. That fall, my old firm downsized, then restructured, then announced a strategic pivot that was really just a veiled retreat. They hadn't seen me coming, because they never looked. And by the time they did, I was too far ahead to chase. But fate has a peculiar sense of symmetry. It doesn't just reward the runner, it circles back. And I was about to come face to face with the man who once told me I was at my limit. Only this time, he'd be the one asking for an opportunity. The day he walked through the glass doors of Arden and Company, I was reviewing a pitch deck with my head of strategy. We had just secured a major account, one his firm had been courting for months. My assistant buzzed in. "There's a Mr. Daniel Hart here," she said, her voice unusually careful. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent." I didn't flinch. I'd prepared for this moment without realizing it. "Have him wait in the reception area," I replied. "I'll be right out." I stood slowly, smoothed the lapels of my navy blazer, and walked out of my office with a composure that belied the quiet tremor of justice that hummed in my bones. And there he was. Daniel Hart, my former boss. The man who once said I was at my limit. Now seated on the plush gray bench outside my office, his eyes scanning the space like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Our receptionist, a sharp, unbothered woman named Keisha, offered him water. He declined. His hands were folded, tight with nervous energy. He stood when he saw me, uncertain. "Olivia," he said, trying to summon the old tone of familiarity. "You've done well for yourself." I tilted my head. "I've done what you said I couldn't." He laughed, awkwardly. "I didn't mean it like that." "No," I said gently, "you meant exactly what you said." There was a pause as the weight of the moment settled between us. The man who had once measured my worth in hourly wages now stood before me looking diminished. Not humiliated, not groveling, but real. Human. Vulnerable in a way I'd never seen. "I'm here because," he hesitated, then finished with a breath, "I need work." For a long moment, I said nothing, just looked at him, not with revenge. Not with cruelty. Just clarity. "We have a front desk position opening," I said. "Customer liaison. It pays hourly. No benefits." He blinked, caught off guard. "That's a bit below my skill set." You once told me that about myself, I said softly. Turns out we were both wrong. And I walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because that moment wasn't about vengeance. It was about closure. And the seat in my reception area was no longer a symbol of hierarchy. It was proof that tables turn. Even the unflippable ones. In the weeks that followed, I hardly saw Daniel. He arrived early, left late, kept his head down. He wore the uniform of someone trying to vanish, neutral tones, polite nods, and a silence that once would have felt foreign on him. There was no ceremony to it. No announcement. Just the quiet hum of justice unfolding as he sat behind the reception desk greeting clients, answering calls, fetching coffee, sometimes for the same people who used to wait outside his office for 10-minute meetings. I thought it might bring me satisfaction. It didn't. What it brought was a kind of peace I hadn't expected. Because now I could see him clearly not as a villain, but as a man who had built his empire on borrowed time and brittle assumptions. A man who had failed to see the fire he was standing beside until it had already become a blaze. One afternoon, I caught him watching me. I had just finished a meeting and was walking past the front desk when our eyes met. I underestimated you, he said quietly, his voice stripped of all its former power. I didn't stop walking, but I offered him the truth as I passed. Everyone did. That night, I stayed late. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to sit in the quiet and remember where I'd come from. I poured a glass of red wine, stood by the tall windows overlooking the city skyline, and pulled out the journal I kept in my desk drawer. The first page still had the word he used, limit, scrawled in thick, angry ink. Below it now, I wrote, redefined, rebuilt, remembered. And as the city lights blinked like distant stars, I felt something shift inside me. Not vengeance. Not triumph. Something older. Something steadier. Wholeness. A few weeks after Daniel's arrival, we installed the legacy wall. It was a glass-paneled installation near the entrance, a timeline etched with the milestones of Arden and Company. The first client. The first award. The expansion into Europe. The year we doubled our staff and still managed to retain 93% of our clients. It was minimalist in style but heavy with meaning. And at the center, beneath the company's motto, no limits, only beginnings, was a photograph. It wasn't of me. It was of my team the day we launched. A candid snapshot of faces filled with unfiltered hope. No suits. No titles. Just dreamers holding clipboards and coffee cups, eyes alight with the kind of belief no paycheck could buy. Daniel passed it every day. I watched once as he paused in front of it, tracing the faces, the lines, the years he had missed while he was looking the other way. He said nothing, but he didn't need to. One morning, Keisha, our receptionist, knocked on my door. She was smiling, that knowing smile she wore when she wanted me to see something for myself. There's a young woman in the lobby, she said. Asked to speak to the founder. Said she read about you in Forbes. I stepped out to see her. She couldn't have been more than 23. Nervous, but not shrinking. I'm sorry for showing up unannounced, she began. I wanted to see it. To see you. I offered her a seat and asked what brought her. She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her bag. A printout of the article. A passage underlined. Every time someone told me I was too young, too soft, or too ambitious, I turned their doubt into data and kept going. Because success doesn't come from being allowed, it comes from refusing to wait for permission. Her eyes brimmed. I keep that by my desk, she said. I'm starting something. It's small, but it's mine. And suddenly I saw myself. Not as the woman in the article or the one with the corner office, but as the girl who used to sit in empty boardrooms on her lunch break, whispering dreams into her notebook because she was too scared to say them out loud. We spoke for nearly an hour. When she left, I walked back through the lobby, and there he was again. Daniel, pretending to review the call log, but watching just the same. This time, I smiled. Because he wasn't watching me. He was witnessing what he never understood, that real power doesn't reside in offices or titles. It's passed in stories. And I was no longer telling his. I was telling mine. There's a particular ache that lingers when you remember all the rooms you used to stand in silently, smiling, nodding, minimizing your brilliance so others could feel bigger beside you. I used to float on the edges of those rooms, offering ideas dressed in questions, so I wouldn't seem too bold. I learned to preface insights with apologies. I might be wrong, but just a thought, maybe, anything to soften the sharpness of what I knew. Because back then, being right wasn't safe. It was threatening. Especially to men like Daniel. But now I build the rooms. One such room sat on the 18th floor of the same building where I'd once been denied an elevator pass because my name wasn't on the important list. A conference suite with floor-to-ceiling views and chairs chosen for posture and poise, not ego. We called it the Forge because everything inside it was meant to shape something new. That morning, I hosted a roundtable of female founders and VCs, some barely past 30, others seasoned with silver at their temples. We talked strategy, shared mistakes, laughed loudly, and cut through the usual performance dance that most boardrooms demand. Halfway through, one of them leaned in, her voice hushed despite our privacy. Do you ever think about who had to underestimate you for this to exist? I nodded, eyes drawn to the skyline. All the time, I said. They were so busy guarding the gates, they didn't notice we were building bridges. Later that evening, I walked the empty halls of Arden and Company. Heels clicking against polished floors that once felt like marble cliffs I'd never climb. Daniel was still at the front, sorting tomorrow's client packets, carefully checking every name. I thought of all the times I'd done that back when a mistake meant more than embarrassment. It meant justification for being overlooked again. You've built something rare here, he said suddenly, without looking up. I waited. No need to rescue him from the silence. I used to think respect was earned by withholding it, he continued. But I see now. I was just afraid. Still, I said nothing. Not out of cruelty, but because some truths must echo before they land. I left him to his own reverberations. That night, I pulled an old photo album from the shelf at home. One page held a photo of me from years ago, standing in the corner of a corporate mixer, half smile on my face, holding a tray of canapés. Behind me, Daniel was laughing with investors, unaware that the woman fetching his drink would one day own the building where his name no longer opened any doors. Some rooms were never meant for me, so I made better ones. People assume the apology is the closure. That one moment of contrition will unlock the heart like a key in a rusted lock. But what I learned is this: healing rarely comes from the words you crave. Daniel never apologized, not directly. Not for the years of being overlooked, the condescension, the ceilings disguised as feedback. And over time, I stopped waiting for it. What came instead was his quiet recalibration. He no longer interrupted women during meetings. No longer spoke in absolutes. No longer assumed that youth equaled ignorance. He was learning, too late for me perhaps, but not too late to matter. And that mattered more than any contrived "I'm sorry" ever could. One afternoon, I watched him speak to a new intern, a black woman with natural curls and a fire in her eyes. She had made a small mistake on a client intake form. Nothing serious, but enough to warrant correction. I held my breath as he approached her. "Good eye for detail," he said gently. "That's fixable. Next time, just double-check the client code." Everything else was sharp. She nodded, and I saw the tension in her shoulders ease. It shouldn't have surprised me. After all, redemption doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, one better decision at a time. That evening, I sat with my COO, Talia, reviewing upcoming hires. We had expanded faster than projections, and the HR department was struggling to keep pace. Talia, pragmatic and brilliant, flipped through resumes while sipping ginger tea. "People keep asking if we're going to open a second branch," she said. "They always ask about the next thing," I replied. "Never about what it cost to build the first." She glanced at me. "You okay?" I paused. It's strange when your life becomes something others reference in motivational talks or case studies. When your victories are admired more for their shock value than the scars they left behind. But I was okay. Not because everything was easy, but because nothing had been wasted. Yes, I said. I'm more than okay. Outside, the city was beginning to glow, windows lighting up one by one like a promise. I thought again about the apology that never came, and how I had stopped needing it. Because I had become something more powerful than forgiven. I had become free. On a rainy Thursday morning, I arrived early to the office, before the rush, before the world asked anything of me. There's something sacred about being first. The hush, the still air, the sense that for a few fleeting moments, you're not chasing the day, you're shaping it. I unlocked my office, turned on the lamp instead of the overhead lights, and opened the small lacquered box that sat on my bookshelf. Inside was a photograph, creased at the corners, soft with time. My mother, back in the 70s, leaning against the hood of her rusted car, legs crossed at the ankle, holding a blueprint. She never got to build what was on that page. Life demanded other things. Bills, children, compromises. She'd been brilliant, though. A mechanical mind in a world that only saw her as a pretty face who should learn to type. When I was 10, I caught her sketching again. It was a quiet rebellion, done at the kitchen table while everyone else was asleep. She never shared those drawings with anyone but me. "Why'd you stop?" I'd asked once. She looked away. Because no one thought it mattered. That photo stayed with me. Through college dorms, studio apartments, and now this penthouse office with floor-to-ceiling windows. She never made it here. But somehow I carried her. Every good idea I ever had came first in her handwriting. Daniel passed by the door that morning, pausing just long enough to nod. "Storm's coming," he said, glancing at the rain. "Already weathered worse," I replied, and we both understood I wasn't talking about the clouds. Later that afternoon, I hosted a mentoring lunch for a group of high school girls interested in entrepreneurship. They came in wide-eyed, gripping notebooks, their faces mirrors of who I used to be, hungry for a map, for proof that it could be done. One girl, shy but sharp, asked, "What's the most important thing to remember when they don't believe in you?" I looked at her, at all of them, and felt that familiar burn in my throat. "That their doubt is not your truth," I said. "Their ceilings are not your sky." They scribbled it down as if it were gospel. I hope they remember. I hope one day, when someone tells them they're at their limit, they smile quietly, stand tall, and keep building. Just like I did. Just like my mother never got the chance to. But maybe, through me, she finally is. The day the new sign went up, the city was drenched in sunlight, the kind that makes glass gleam like water and shadows seem like myths. It had taken 2 years of negotiations, rezoning, design approvals, and most of all, patience. But finally, the flagship headquarters of Arden and Company was moving from our rented floors into a building we now owned outright. My name, etched in silver on a curved panel of stone and glass, shimmered above the main entrance. The Arden Building. No ampersands. No fine print. Just the name I had reclaimed. I stood across the street, coffee in hand, and watched the installation crew work. There were no balloons, no ribbon-cutting ceremony. I didn't need applause. I had outgrown that hunger. What I craved now was legacy. Daniel arrived 15 minutes before opening, like he always did. He stopped mid-step when he saw the sign. He didn't speak. Just looked at it for a long while. Behind me, someone murmured, "Must feel good." I turned. It was Talia. Ever observant, ever grounded. "It does," I said. "But not in the way you'd think." She nodded, then handed me a small wrapped package. Office warming gift. Inside was a delicate glass paperweight, shaped like a mountain peak. "The summit," she said. Or at least one of them. I held it in my palm, the weight cool and reassuring. We walked in together, past the doors I once dreamed of, into the space that now bore the imprint of every risk I'd taken. The lobbies smelled of fresh paint and ambition. Soft music played from hidden speakers. The floors shone like the future. And behind the reception desk, Daniel was already reviewing the guest list, pen in hand. He looked up as I passed. "Congratulations," he said. Sincerely. I paused. "Thank you," I replied. "It's not just mine." He nodded, understanding more than he used to, because this building, this company, this story, it wasn't born from revenge. It was born from all the things women are told to silence: audacity, vision, instinct. And now it stood tall, with my name on it. After the move, I started going through old files. Not digital ones, the paper stacks I'd collected over the years. Receipts from business lunches I'd paid for out of pocket. Meeting notes in my handwriting, later presented under someone else's name. Printouts of slide decks I'd built, highlighted in yellow by Daniel as surprisingly good. Surprisingly. I laid them all out on the floor of my new office one Sunday afternoon, when the building was still quiet, as if I needed to see them laid bare before I could truly release them. It was an inventory of the invisible, the labor no one had credited, the hours no one remembered, the grace I'd offered when fury would have been justified. I didn't cry. I thought I might. But instead I smiled. Because every overlooked moment had added up, not to bitterness, but to something solid. Something undeniable. I built a bonfire in my mind that day. And in it, I placed every belittlement disguised as advice, every just playing devil's advocate, every time I'd been told to smile more. They burned. What remained was clarity. That week, I called a meeting of our leadership team and announced a new initiative: shadow work recognition grants. Every quarter, we would nominate employees, often women, often people of color, who did invisible labor, mentoring interns, smoothing over client missteps, bringing emotional intelligence to conflict resolution. The things that didn't show up on a balance sheet but held the whole damn place together. We would see them. We would name their worth. We would pay it forward, literally. At the end of the meeting, Talia leaned over and said, "You're rewriting the playbook." "No," I said. "I'm finally writing my own." And outside, the sign on the building caught the late afternoon light. The name glowed. But this time, so did the people behind it. Success has a curious way of resurfacing the past. It stirs old names, triggers contact from people who once forgot you existed until your name landed in headlines or whispered conversations at networking events. They began appearing like ghosts, former classmates, distant cousins, even an old mentor who'd once told me, "You're smart, but not quite leadership material yet." One afternoon, I received a message request on LinkedIn. The profile picture made my breath catch for just a second. Bethany Chase. My college roommate. Once my closest friend. Until she wasn't. She'd gone silent the week I landed my first big internship at the very firm Daniel ran. She had applied too. She didn't get it. We never recovered. Now her message read, "I've been following your company. Incredible work. Any chance you're hiring? I'd love to reconnect." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was angry, but because I was different. I no longer needed to prove myself to anyone from that chapter of my life. But I also didn't need to pretend the past hadn't shaped me. I replied, "Thank you, Bethany. We are hiring. Apply through our site and note that we were connected in college. I'll make sure the team takes a close look." Simple. Professional. No ice, no fire. Just distance. Earned. That evening, as I left the office, I caught a glimpse of Daniel polishing the reception desk, an old habit he'd developed, probably for peace. The way he worked now, quiet and careful, reminded me of something my grandmother once said. People change when the mirror stops lying. He had stopped asking for forgiveness, and perhaps that's why the weight of it finally began to shift. In the lobby, someone new approached him, young, fresh out of grad school, eyes full of ambition. She asked where to go for her first day onboarding. He stood, smiled gently, and said, "Right this way. Welcome to Arden." And in that moment, I saw it. How the story was folding in on itself. How all the old faces were returning, but framed in new truths. And I was no longer inside their narratives. They were stepping into mine. There was a room in the new building no one used at first. Down the main corridor, past the executive offices and strategy suites. Just a door with frosted glass that read Founder's Library. We hadn't meant for it to be symbolic. It started as a personal idea, somewhere to house the books, the journals, the artifacts of the journey. But over time, it took on a different gravity. The first thing I placed there was my mother's blueprint. Framed in matte black, her signature still faintly visible at the bottom. It hung above a velvet settee near the window. Then came a copy of our first business license. Our first balance sheet. A worn Arden and Company hoodie someone gifted me after our first retreat. Artifacts of struggle. Keepsakes of faith. And then, the letters. So many women had written to me over the years, emails, thank you cards, scrawled notes handed to me after panels or workshops. You made me believe I could speak up. I watched your interview the day after my boss took credit for my project. I didn't quit. I started my plan. My daughter calls you her hero. So do I. I couldn't bear to throw them away. So I collected them, cataloged, dated, cherished. And when team members needed to remember why we did what we did, they wandered in there. One day, I found Daniel inside. He wasn't sitting. He was standing by the bookshelf, reading The Spine of Women and Power by Mary Beard, fingers trailing lightly across the jacket. He turned when I entered, startled. I didn't mean to intrude. You didn't, I said. This room is for everyone who forgot they were allowed to dream big. He nodded, eyes clouded with something I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't regret. It was grief. And I understood it not because I felt sorry for him, but because I'd carried my own version of that grief. The ache of wasted time, of not listening sooner, of playing small for the comfort of others. Do you ever wonder, he asked, what would have happened if I'd said yes to that race? I smiled softly. You'd still be up there. I'd still be in your shadow. We stood in silence a moment longer. Then I left him there, alone in a room filled with the voices of women who had found their way forward, without needing anyone's permission. It was our 5th anniversary, a milestone few startups reach, and even fewer reach while still holding onto their soul. Arden and Company had not only survived, it had grown roots. Deep ones. So we hosted a gala. Not just to celebrate profits or metrics, but to honor the people behind the spreadsheets. The builders. The believers. The ballroom shimmered with warm light. No cold spotlight, no glass podiums. Just long tables dressed in linen, laughter rippling like wine through tall grass. The centerpieces were made of wildflowers, nothing forced, nothing too curated. Like us. I wore deep green. Not because it made me stand out, but because it made me feel grounded. Daniel was there. He'd been invited like every employee, no special note, no omission. He wore a suit that hung slightly looser than it used to. Time humbles us differently. He didn't speak much, but I caught him clapping genuinely when we handed out the Rising Star Award to Jaya, our newest junior partner who'd gone from intern to exec in 3 years flat. When it came time for my speech, the room hushed. I stood at the center. No stage. Just me and the people who had shaped this journey. I want to say something I've never said publicly, I began. A pause. Not for drama, but because some truths must be invited with silence. This company was born the day someone told me I had reached my limit. That was the phrase. A limit. And I almost believed it. The room remained still. But what I've learned since then is this. Our limits are often other people's fears dressed as advice. And when we internalize those fears, we shrink. We step aside. We become polite instead of powerful. A soft murmur of agreement. But not here, I continued. Here we grow. We rise. We remember. Applause swelled, not loud but full, the kind that comes from people who've lived what you're saying. Afterward, Daniel approached. He waited his turn, behind junior staff and old investors. He didn't interrupt. When he reached me, he extended his hand. Not for a shake, but to offer something, a small, folded piece of paper. I found this in the back of an old drawer at the firm, he said. It had your name on it. I think it was meant for you. I opened it later, alone, in the quiet of my office. It was a memo. My first pitch for a leadership initiative, dated 3 years before I left. At the bottom, a handwritten note in Daniel's unmistakable script, too idealistic. Not the right time. And below that, in pen, someone else had scribbled, watch her. No signature. No clue who wrote it. But I smiled, because someone had seen me, even then. And now the whole world would. There was a time when I'd have read that old memo and wept. Not from pain, but from that quiet despair born of being ahead of your time in rooms built for repetition, not revolution. But now? I folded it gently, placed it in the archive binder in the Founders Library, and whispered thanks to the unknown hand that once wrote, watch her. Because someone did. And because someone did, I survived long enough to be seen. Later that week, I was invited to speak at a summit, an international gathering of founders and innovators hosted in Lisbon. I almost declined. Not out of fear. Out of weariness. I'd spent years earning this place at the table. I no longer needed to prove I belonged. But something about this event tugged at me. So I went. The venue was sleek, all marble and glass. The kind of architecture meant to remind you of power. As I walked into the keynote lounge, I saw them, the same men who had once spoken over me in meetings, now lined up to shake my hand. Funny how rooms change when your name comes with a comma and a valuation. I gave my talk on building inclusive legacy without apology. I saw pens scribble faster than usual. Saw heads nod slowly, like they were hearing something they hadn't known they needed. Afterward, a young woman from Berlin approached me. She was trembling, clutching a program in one hand and a portfolio in the other. I've followed your journey, she said, accent lilting. Your story gave me permission to start. I used to think I needed someone to choose me, but now I choose myself. And, just like that, I remembered why I still showed up. Why the fight had been worth it. Not for claps. Not for features. But for that moment. For her. For every woman still waiting in rooms full of mirrors, wondering if what they saw in themselves was enough to be real. When I returned home, I added her note to the library. It read, she chose herself. And that changed everything. I underlined it in ink, once, softly, and left it there to echo. It happened on a Thursday, quiet, like most reckonings. A message from Daniel appeared in my inbox, flagged with low priority. He never asked for meetings, never presumed space. But this one was simple. May I have a few minutes of your time before the quarter ends? I'd like to share something. I scheduled 15 minutes. Out of courtesy. Out of curiosity. He entered my office with a manila envelope and a solemnness I recognized. Not regret, exactly, but readiness. There's a difference. I've been applying for roles elsewhere, he began. It's time. You've given me more dignity than I earned. And this chapter, it needs to close with gratitude, not guilt. I studied him. He was smaller now, not physically, but in energy. The man who once filled rooms with bravado now occupied space carefully, like he knew its value. He handed me the envelope. This is my official resignation. But before I go, I wanted you to have this. Inside were 3 things. A printed photo from our company gala, the one where I spoke in green velvet, surrounded by employees who looked like the future. Someone had scribbled on the back, "This is the room you built." A handwritten letter. I didn't read it then. I waited. A bronze key. I looked up. When I started in business, he said, my mentor told me to guard access, to make people earn their seat. He paused, then continued. You taught me something else. You built a place where people open doors for others without fear of losing their own. That key, it's symbolic. But it's yours, because you unlocked something I didn't even know I'd shut away. I said nothing, just nodded, Sometimes grace is quiet. Sometimes it's heavy. He stood. Thank you for letting me start over. Even if it was under fluorescent lights and behind a desk. After he left, I opened the letter. It was simple, unadorned. You were never at your limit. I was at mine. Thank you for surpassing us all. I folded it gently and placed it in the library, beside the others. Not out of sentimentality, out of truth. He was part of the story, too. A caution, a turning point, a chapter closed. And as I walked through the lobby that afternoon, I noticed the empty reception chair for the first time since he'd arrived. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt like space. The next morning, the reception desk sat empty, quiet under the glow of pendant lights. For a moment, I stood there, listening, not for footsteps, but for absence. The kind that lingers when a long noise finally stills. Keisha approached, her heels clicking a soft rhythm. You all right? She asked, eyes reading me like she always could. I nodded, just thinking how much noise one man's silence used to make. She chuckled. He wasn't all bad. Just late to the truth. Maybe, I said. But he showed up eventually. Most don't. That day, we held an all-hands meeting to announce some internal restructuring. Promotions. Department expansions. But before we began, I took a moment. Just one. Before we dive into the agenda, I said, I want to acknowledge something. The room stilled. This company was founded on defiance. On the belief that being told no is often the first step toward a better yes. But what we've built since isn't about rebellion. It's about redefinition. About rewriting what leadership, worth, and success look like. Heads nodded. Some hands tightened around mugs. Eyes sparkled, not with tears, but with recognition. Today, I want each of you to remember, I continued, that the rooms you walk into are changed simply because you're in them. Don't let anyone make you shrink to fit. After the meeting, I passed the founder's library and paused. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, a young analyst, Mira, was flipping through the archive binder, the one where I'd placed the letter from Daniel just the day before. She hadn't noticed me yet. She was reading slowly, her finger tracing words on the page, as if they were a map she needed to memorize. I knocked softly on the frame. She turned, startled. I didn't mean to intrude, she began. You didn't, I said. This room is yours too. She hesitated. I come in here when I forget what I'm capable of. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. The truest legacy isn't a building or a brand. It's the moment someone else sees themselves in your story and decides to begin their own. Somewhere between the third expansion and our new partnership deal in London, I realized something strange had happened. I'd stopped racing. Not because the road had ended, but because I no longer needed to outrun anything. That morning, I canceled 2 meetings, left my assistant a note, and walked no car, no agenda through the streets of the city where I had once cried in stairwells after being talked over, belittled, dismissed. The skyline hadn't changed, but I had. I passed my old building. The one with the lobby where I was once mistaken for an assistant and told to wait until someone important could see me. The irony bloomed warm in my chest. Inside, I caught a glimpse of their new receptionist through the glass. A woman, maybe in her 20s, wearing a blazer too big and shoes clearly meant for longer days than her feet were used to. She looked tired. But her eyes, those eyes were bright. Alert. Hungry. I stood there for a moment, unseen, and whispered a wish. May you never swallow your brilliance just to be liked. I didn't go in. Some rooms are only meant to be exited. When I returned to Arden and Company, I walked past every award on the wall, every plaque and framed article, and went straight to the small private office at the far end of the hallway. The door bore no name, but inside, on the shelf, sat a sign I'd placed there years ago. You are already enough. Now build from there. It was a quote from the first leadership retreat I ever hosted, before anyone believed a woman-led firm could last more than a quarter in a saturated market. I sat down on the couch in that room, shoes off, hair unbound. And I rested. Not because I was tired, but because I had earned it. That room wasn't for hustle. It was for remembering that even in a world that constantly demanded more, sometimes the most radical thing a woman could be was whole. Not long after my quiet afternoon in the room called enough, I received an envelope addressed in looping script. No return address, no email trail. Inside was a single page of heavy, textured paper. Dear Olivia, you don't know me, but I know who you are. Not from headlines, not from LinkedIn, but because I used to sit behind you in every finance class at university, scribbling numbers and hiding ideas. You spoke with certainty. I whispered. You raised your hand. I waited until the room was empty to gather my courage. And yet, the day you pitched your final business plan, I saw the future. Not just yours. Mine. Because you made it possible to imagine a world where women didn't just ask to be included, they created the damn tables. I never got to thank you then. So I'm thanking you now. I've just signed the lease for my first office. It's barely big enough for a desk and 2 chairs. But it's mine, and on the wall I've placed a quote that once sat in the background of your dorm room window. Make them wonder how you did it with a smile. Thank you for showing me how. In solidarity. A woman you taught without trying. I sat with the letter for a long time, the paper warm from my touch, heavy with meaning. We never know who is watching us survive. We never know whose permission we are embodying just by existing out loud. Later that evening, I made a copy of the letter and added it to the library. Then I took the original, framed it in gold, and hung it behind my desk, not for vanity, but for memory. Because the real victory wasn't in toppling empires or building firms. It was in becoming the kind of woman who no longer needed to be seen to make an impact. I had become the mirror. And now others could find their own reflection in the glass. We were interviewing for a new senior strategist, one of our biggest roles yet, leading the expansion into emerging markets. I wasn't involved in most of the hiring process anymore, but this one mattered. This one was personal, because the role was being vacated by Talia. She had come to my office the week before with calm eyes and steady words. I've built all I needed to hear, she said. And I've learned more than I ever could have asked. But it's time for something that belongs entirely to me. There was no drama, no tears, only pride, and the soft ache of parting. We'd built this company together, brick by careful brick. She'd been my anchor, my second wind, my mirror on days when I wasn't sure who I was becoming. So we planned an exit interview, not just to review logistics, but to honor what we had shared. It took place in the library. Talia chose that room herself. She walked in with a mug of rooibos tea and the same quiet poise she always carried. I want to thank you, she said, for building a place where I didn't have to pretend. I smiled. You never did. That's why you led so well. We spoke for nearly 2 hours about mentorship, about boundaries, about the importance of leaving on your own terms before you begin to resent the very thing you once loved. I used to think legacy was what you leave behind, she said near the end. But I think now it's what continues to grow after you've let go. She handed me a small wrapped gift before she left. Inside was a compass. Not new. Well worn. Edges softened by time. I found it at a vintage shop, she said. Because even trailblazers need direction sometimes. After she walked out of the building, I sat with it in my hands and let myself feel the shift. Leadership isn't about keeping people forever. It's about making sure they leave stronger than when they arrived. And in that moment, I knew. Arden and Company was no longer a refuge for those seeking worth. It was a launchpad. I first noticed her in the crowd outside a speaking engagement downtown, a cold February evening, the kind where your breath lingers longer than your voice. She wore a striking red coat. Not trendy, timeless. Wool, belted, dignified. Like armor. She didn't approach me then, just stood near the curb, watching as I shook hands and posed for photos. Something in her stillness felt familiar, like déjà vu of a life I'd almost lived. 3 weeks later, she appeared again, This time in our building, outside the founder's library. "I'm sorry," she said when I spotted her. "I know I shouldn't be here without an appointment. I just needed to see it." I offered her tea and time. She was a professor of organizational behavior, recently retired, and newly unsettled by how little change she'd seen in the rooms she'd once taught future leaders to inhabit. "I followed your rise," she confessed. "Read your articles. Watched your interviews. I taught women like you once. Bright, blazing, full of potential. Most of them burned out or were burned down." She looked around the library, eyes glassy. "I wanted to know if this place was real. If it actually existed." I nodded. "It does. Because we stopped asking for room. We started building our own." She smiled, slow and reverent. "I used to dream about places like this. But we were told to wait. To be patient." Her voice caught. "And we waited so long, we almost forgot what we were waiting for." Before she left, I asked if she'd like to contribute something to the archive. She opened her satchel and pulled out a folded syllabus, Women in Leadership, Structures, Systems, and Sabotage. A course she taught for 15 years. I held it with care as though it might disappear. "This was our way of planting seeds," she said. "Even if we never saw the bloom." I placed it next to the mirror letter and labeled it, "The Woman in the Red Coat, Architect of Bloom." And for days afterward, I found myself walking past it, smiling not just at the words, but at the truth they carried. We are the bloom. We are the evidence that the wait was not wasted. Spring came late that year. March dragged its feet, hesitant to thaw. The trees remained bare longer than usual, as if the world itself wasn't sure it was ready to grow again. But inside Arden and Company, something different was happening. It started with the break room. What had once been a utilitarian space, a microwave, a few steel stools, a sterile coffee station, began to bloom. Literally. One morning, I walked in to find a row of succulents on the windowsill. The next, a bulletin board had appeared with Polaroids of team lunches, birthdays, quotes scribbled on neon post-its. Then came the books, shelved quietly, left by different hands. Memoirs. Poetry. Essays on rest as resistance. The room transformed itself not by order, but by care. No memo went out. No directive from leadership. It just happened. I asked around, curious. Turned out it began with Mira, the same intern-turned-analyst I'd found in the founder's library months before. She'd started staying late. Not because she had to, but because it felt like home. "I just thought," she said shyly when I asked, "that we should have a space where we breathe without asking permission." That night, I walked back through the office after hours. Past the polished glass, the conference rooms with plans and pitches scribbled on white boards, past the wall of awards and into the small oasis Mira had seeded. There was a single orchid blooming on the counter. And on the fridge, a magnet held a handwritten note. "Not everything we plant is for profit. Some things are just meant to be beautiful." I stood there for a long time, because I realized then what we'd built wasn't just a company. It was a garden, grown from sacrifices and second guesses, from whispered dreams and defiant decisions. A garden we never watered in the beginning, too busy proving our place in barren rooms. But now it was flourishing. And it would feed more than just us. At a high-level investor dinner that spring, I found myself seated beside a man whose name once dominated finance headlines, Maxwell Shaw. He was old guard, wealth from legacy, legacy from empire, empire from silence. The kind who'd been groomed not to question systems because he was born inside their safety. He leaned toward me mid-course, after the foie gras and before the tenderloin. "You've built something elegant," he said. "Wasn't sure at first if it would last. Not because you're a woman," he added quickly, "but because the world's loud. You lead quietly." I took a sip of water, measured my breath. "That's how gardens grow," I replied. "Not with noise. With roots." He chuckled, not unkindly. "Well said." There was no tension between us, not anymore. just distance. Time had worn down the old condescension into curiosity. I didn't need to defend myself, and he no longer needed to pretend he understood me. After dinner, a young associate approached me in the lobby. She wore a navy blazer that didn't quite fit her shoulders and clutched a folder too tightly. "I know this is forward," she said, "but do you remember the panel at NYU 2 years ago? You said something that's lived in my head ever since." I smiled. "What was it?" She recited, word for word, "You're not too ambitious. They're just too used to women who whisper." I hadn't remembered saying it, but she had, and that was enough. Later, I returned to my office and stared at the long table in the conference room. 10 chairs. Each one once filled by someone who questioned if I belonged. Now filled by people who looked to me not for permission, but for partnership. I sat in the chair at the head of the table not because I needed to prove anything, but because it was mine. Earned, held, and made ready for the next to claim. The quiet seat. At the table I built. There was a fire drill at headquarters one Friday afternoon, one of those unplanned alarms that cut through meetings, startled phone calls, and made us all shuffle into the sunlight like schoolchildren. We gathered on the plaza in clumps of loose conversation, employees checking watches and trading jokes. But for a moment, I stood alone near the perimeter, watching the building. Watching my building. It was strange how calm I felt, despite the alarm. Maybe it was muscle memory, or maybe it was something deeper, an understanding that I no longer lived in fear of everything burning down. Because I had learned how to rebuild. More than once. Back when I worked under Daniel, fire had always felt close. Invisible threats. One wrong email, one assertive comment misread as attitude, and everything could go up in flames. I had lived with the fear of being too much and not enough, both at once. But that day, surrounded by a team who saw each other not as threats, but as fuel, bright, necessary, different kinds of fire, I felt only peace. Back inside, Mira handed me a safety report she'd compiled voluntarily. "You never know when a real fire might hit," she said with a grin. I smiled. "We've already survived worse." That evening, I walked through the founder's library and paused by the newest shelf, Lessons from Loss. It held stories from team members who had failed before they found their footing. Anonymous entries about missed chances, layoffs, betrayals. And yet, each story ended the same way. And then I began again. We had started calling it the Phoenix Shelf. Because sometimes rising wasn't about triumph. It was about not giving up. Not when the flames licked close. Not when the floor gave out. Not even when no one cheered your return. I placed my own story there that night. The memo Daniel once rejected. The job I was once denied. The laughter that told me I'd gone as far as I could go. And beneath it, I wrote, "This fire built the woman who built the building." Then I turned out the light and left the room still warm.